Hey guys, it's Emily Yates here from PEHP. I'm going to do a webinar for you all, managing anxiety and worry. I think even for some of the most rock solid, right now is a bit challenging. So I'm hoping I can just give you guys some helpful information to kind of learn how to manage anxiety and worry. The goals I would like to reach today with this webinar are basically just talking about anxiety symptoms, the worrying that goes along with anxiety, and then some strategies to teach you guys kind of how to deal with some of these intrusive thoughts and worrying that are probably the hardest part of anxiety. But just so you guys all know, anxiety is a totally normal part of life. It can be very helpful in things like preparing for a big presentation. It's kind of what motivates us to get going and get planning so we do a good job. Or anxiety can also kind of kick in as this instinctual protective mechanism, right? In times of like great need, maybe after a car accident. And we all know how this feels, right? Anxiety, our heart rate increases, we might get lightheaded, stomach ache, sweating, all those types of things. But if your body is kind of constantly in this mode, geared up for action, anxious and worried over everyday events, this kind of anxiety can be very incapacitating for a lot of people, and it may be indicative of a more serious anxiety disorder. But you know what? Anxiety disorders are super common right now in the United States. They're actually the #1 mental health disorder in the United States, but they're quite ambiguous, right? And sometimes it's hard to know exactly when it's time to get help, see a professional, or when you just kind of need to have some strategies. So that's kind of what I want to focus on today. Anxiety is different for everyone, for sure. I love this little picture of this little boy because I think a lot of personality and genetics go into it, right? I mean, look at this little boy. A certain personality might see all those stairs and think, wow, what a great challenge. This is awesome, and fly up them, right? And another little boy, he might look at that, oh my gosh, this is so hard. This is so scary, right? So we all kind of perceive life totally different, which is what makes humans special. But in terms of anxiety, some of us, certain things trigger anxiety. Some people have situational anxiety where certain situations might trigger some anxiety. Other have kind of fear of social spaces or social situations. Some people have more of like panic disorders, panic attacks. So they're going about their day feeling great, and then boom, out of nowhere, serious panic attack, which can a lot of times send people to the hospital. And then some people have this kind of anxiety where it's this uncontrollable worry, and it's about almost everything in their lives, right? School, work, relationships, and this kind of relationship anxiety is called generalized anxiety disorder. And this is kind of what I want to focus on today, so we can kind of keep on track and stay focused on one thing rather than trying to cover all anxiety in one webinar, because that would be too much information. With generalized anxiety, like I said, we worry about everything, and this kind of excessive worry produces physical symptoms in our body, and we all know these symptoms, right? We get really tired, sweating, agitation, irritable, restless, a lot of emotional distress, emotional reactivity. We can feel pain and tension in our bodies, headaches, trembling, we can't concentrate, have trouble falling asleep. And so when you're feeling these feelings, this is actually fight or flight. And this is our body's just normal response to a threat, like I said. But the problem is, if you have something like generalized anxiety, you're having these worries all the time that are kind of producing these feelings and physical responses all the time. And you know what? If you feel like this for a long period of time, it actually can make you quite sick. And we can actually see this reflected in some of our hospitals across the state and also the nation. This is data from 2 general medical clinics at the University of Utah Hospital. And so 47% of patients actually had an identifiable anxiety disorder, and 42% of the patients had depression. And more than half of all patients coming in had some type of anxiety or depressive disorder. But the thing with these patients is they really weren't going in there for their depression or anxiety. They were going in because they were feeling sick. They thought they were having heart attacks or like a stroke or maybe something neurological because they are super stressed out or depressed, which always can manifest in some way in physical sickness. So they actually don't have anything diagnosably wrong with them. It's just kind of these symptoms of what's going on, with their mental state. There is a medical explanation why you can start feeling like something is really wrong with you physically when actually you're fine. And this is called somatization. And this occurs when physiological concerns you're feeling are converted into physical symptoms. And this is kind of speaks to something called the mind-body connection. And just to be clear, these symptoms, they're not imagined, they're real and they're distressing and they can be quite uncomfortable and painful for people. So it's not like they're faking it. I don't want to give off that idea at all. It just illustrates how our mind and body and environment, they're always in communication with each other. And if something's bothering you in your head and if you're distressed, it's going to manifest in some way physically. With that said, think of your brain, the mind and the body being connected and continually talking to each other, like I mentioned before. Now think of your brain as any other muscle in your body. You build circuits in your brain like you would build muscle in your body with exercise, right? But here, anxiety, in a way, is the workout. And so the more we do certain tasks and activities, we are essentially creating and reinforcing complex neural networks and pathways in our brain. And so the more anxious we are, the more we're reinforcing anxiety in our brains and also in the body. But for those with us with anxiety, we all know how hard it is to take a break, right? And to get our brain to stop working out in that way. But luckily there is an explanation for this. And scientists do believe now that there's some type of broken communication between areas of the brain and anxious people. And that's kind of why the panic button stays on for so long. And so this broken communication is between our prefrontal cortex, which is kind of located right here in our forehead. And this is kind of the center of our emotional regulation. And then the other part of the brain is the amygdala, kind of located in the back here. And this is the part of the brain that actually initiates fight or flight and responds to stressful situations. So one way I had this explained to me in graduate school, which I love, is, we have 2 minds in our brain, right? And I love our little eggs. We have our mad egg. He's just not very happy, not very content. And then our happy egg, just kind of content and peaceful, right? So the mad egg, that's our amygdala, right? This is our fearful, emotional part of the brain. This responds to threats, and it's always scanning and looking for threats, right? The prefrontal cortex, this can be like the CEO of the brain, but a good CEO. This is wise, compassionate. This is our rational mind, right? And so a stronger connection means that our prefrontal cortex can tell the amygdala to quiet down when we're stressed out. So this might help explain to some of us anxious people out there why we have such a hard time turning our anxiety off. But I think this is good news in a way, because I think once you know kind of what the problem is, you can fix it. And later in this webinar, we're going to be talking about ways we can quiet down our amygdala. I now want to take a minute and discuss the difference kind of between anxiety and worry. So anxiety is a complex threat mode, and it involves our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And those thoughts, feelings, and emotions, they create a physical response, I said, and then it ultimately, leads to some type of behavior, whether that be good or bad. Worrying, on the other hand, this is the thinking part. This is where we're kind of thinking about how we're going to deal with this threat, because in some ways this threat to us is uncontrollable and unpredictable, right? And so worrying is where we plan, right? We want to avoid this threat, or we want to like have this threat hurt us less. And this is important, right? Planning serves a purpose, and actually worrying serves a purpose, right? But when it becomes excessive, like I said, it can kind of get out of control and turn into, like I said, generalized anxiety disorder. So generalized anxiety disorder is excessive worry about many things as opposed to just a specific situational problem where you're anxious about it, but then the problem's over and then you can kind of return to kind of a normal baseline functioning. And this is worrying that is present on most days for more than 6 months. And it's worrying that's difficult to control, and it becomes severe and intrusive in your life, to the point where it's hard to concentrate or complete daily tasks. And then you really start feeling, like I said, some of the body tension and physical symptoms. So as I'm talking about this and reading the information off this slide, if this is resonating with you, I think this is a time where you should maybe seek some help and talk to a counselor, because there's so many great modalities and therapies to help you with this. And at the end of this webinar, I'll have some resources for you all. As you can imagine, excessive worry and worry in general, it's pretty common. So 1/3 of people classify themselves as non-worriers. So this means they worry less than an hour and an hour and a half each day. Great for them, super jealous. But more than half of people classify themselves as moderate worriers. And these are people who worry between 10 to 50% of the day. And so for some of these people, they're not really troubled by this worrying, because they're kind of able to keep it under control, not let it get excessive. And so the remainder of those chronic worriers are people for worry more than 8 hours a day. So I don't know, I'm not great at math. That's probably 16% of us are chronic worriers. But the fact that half of us are moderate worriers, I mean, that's a lot of people. So I think it's really important to kind of learn how to keep our worrying in check so it doesn't kind of turn into a bigger problem. I want to talk about why we worry so much. So we've evolved this way, right? The ability to plan ahead is what separates humans from other animals. And in a way, our worrying, it's a good thing, right? It's not bad. It motivates us. It helps us plan accordingly, right? And it all kind of, but we also need to keep this in perspective, because according to science, 98% of our perceived threats never happen. And if we have anxiety and we're like really thinking the worst is going to happen, we are reliving this catastrophe every day when it's not actually happening. So we're actually not having any new thoughts, which is just crazy. And I just absolutely love this quote. When I look back on all these worries, I remember the story of the old man who said on his deathbed that he had a lot of trouble in his life, most of which had never happened. I mean, how true is this, right? I think we can all totally relate to this, but I think it's also important to remember, like, we are biologically wired to worry. It's why we have been so successful as humans. Another reason we worry so much is because, like I said, we're humans and we have egos, right? And a lot of our distressful thoughts that cause anxiety kind of come from our egos, right? And so let's talk a little bit about ego thoughts. Things like, how do I measure up? Am I making it? Am I acceptable? Do people love me? Am I worthy? Right? If you're feeling inadequate, like you have to prove yourself to yourself or to others, how many times a day do you say, I have so much to do? And a lot of times we're saying that is because we just feel like we have all these needs we need to fulfill for everyone in our lives. Or maybe we have these worrying thoughts because we're trying, to protect our ego, right? If you're feeling threatened or diminished, like people don't respect you or value you, right? Or maybe you're having kind of worry, troubled thoughts because you're being judgmental. You take offense easily. If things don't go, your way, it's their fault, right? And so a lot of these distressful thoughts actually come from our ego. And when we think from our ego, see our little eggs, we're actually using that part of the brain I was talking about, the amygdala. And so now I want to kind of give some examples of thoughts we experience when we're anxious. Just take a moment here and kind of put yourself in that place when you're anxious or stressed, and kind of think of how you're feeling and the thoughts you're feeling. And I'm going to read off this list and see if any of this resonates with you. So, I don't have time. I won't be good enough. I'll never make it. What if they don't like me? What's wrong with me? I won't get enough sleep and tomorrow will be a wreck, right? I don't have enough. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough stuff. Will I get caught? Will people find me out? Something must be physically wrong with me. I've taken on too much. People are going to find me out, right? Okay, so when I think these thoughts for sure when I'm anxious, but I think there's definitely a theme here, and that is a lot of these thoughts, they're just not very nice. And of course, these kinds of thoughts are going to make us feel anxious. And so let's take a minute to talk about maybe some reasons why we're having these kinds of thoughts in the first place. Okay, so if it feels like I'm in a different space, I am. Bear with me. I'm doing this recording at home while I'm working from home, husband working from home. He had a meeting, had to reconfigure space, so that's what's happening here. But back to the webinars. So why you might be having some of these kind of negative thoughts is because of feelings of personal vulnerability, right? When you're vulnerable, you feel like you could be harmed physically or emotionally, like people won't accept you, or feeling like you're not good enough. I mean, that's just kind of like what being vulnerable is. And so our feelings inform our thoughts, right? So if we're feeling a certain way, we're going to have certain thoughts. So maybe you're feeling you have a lack of control in your life. You feel out of control. And maybe it's not out of control like you're wild or crazy. It's just because you're not feeling valued or heard in certain situations. That can be a really hard feeling. Or maybe you're having feelings of inadequacy where, your issues with personal worth, or having self-esteem issues, or identity issues. Or maybe you're just in a place where it's getting kind of bad, where you just have feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, and that makes you feel super vulnerable when you feel like there's really nothing you can do to protect yourself or to make yourself feel better. So I think it's always important to remember, if you're having certain thoughts that aren't serving you, that are negative, to kind of tune into your body and pay attention to how you're feeling, and sometimes it can kind of help you sort things out. You also might be worrying too much because you just have this basic intolerance of uncertainty. And I think there's a lot of people where we just cannot deal with uncertainty. We like to have some sense of control in every aspect of our life, and that's just kind of how we operate, and that's how we feel like we're succeeding and doing well, if we feel like very in control of everything. But this is completely faulty thinking because so much of life is uncertain. And I think I have to bring up COVID-19 right now in this pandemic because this is just an absolute nightmare for someone with anxiety, because the essence, I think, of this pandemic is uncertainty, right? Even our top medical experts, they can only predict like what the best outcome will be. And so I think we can get in that mode of worrying and worrying and worrying because we really have a hard time with things just being uncertainty. And a lot of this can stem from just having kind of like lack of curiosity and openness in life. And we'll talk about that a little later on in the webinar. Some of us worry because we catastrophize everything and it's terrifying. And I think for me personally, this was eye-opening for me after I had my baby and I was experiencing intense anxiety. My first outing was going skiing with my husband, and skiing is something I love. It's my favorite thing to do ever. But I couldn't enjoy myself because I kept thinking, my husband's going to hit a tree, we're going to get caught in an avalanche, like we're going to die. Like that was basically the outcome of the day. A nice day of skiing turned into someone's going to die. And I think for me, that was the moment I realized I needed help with my anxiety. But I think if you do have anxiety, I think you can relate to what I'm saying. We can very quickly go to the worst place. And the problem with this is it can quickly become a habit. And there's actually some reasons for that. So some of us worry because it gives us this false sense of control. Like I said, a lot of our worrying is caused by feeling out of control about what could happen in the future. So here's an example. You're doing something and the something is worrying to prevent or solve the catastrophe. And when the catastrophe doesn't happen, you attribute that to the worry. So that's kind of how this worrying and catastrophizing can become a habit. But it's not true. And I think if we all sat down and rationally thought about it, we would deeply know that our worrying didn't prevent the catastrophe. But it kind of creates a continual negative headspace when we get in this place. And I'll talk about that next. Okay, so does worry prevent or worsen failure? And we're going to talk a little bit about law of expectations, which is basically you get what you expect out of life, right? So let's use giving a talk as an example, because I think for most people, public speaking and talking in public is terrifying. I think people are more afraid of death than public speaking. So while you're practicing your talk, if you're worrying and if you're thinking of the worst, oh my gosh, I'm not good enough, this is going to be so hard, it's going to be a nightmare, whatever, you're actually practicing failure and living the catastrophe all at the same time. And if you're like telling yourself while you're practicing, this is not going to be great, it can very quickly become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And I just love this quote, worry does not empty tomorrow of its sorrow, it empties today of its strength, right? So it kind of comes back to that thinking, like we think worrying is helping us, but really worry is harming us for sure. Okay, so this is the part of the webinar I really enjoy. So now that we've kind of talked about anxiety and worry and why we worry, let's talk about some ways to deal with it. And we're going to use 3 different strategies. So we're going to use some cognitive strategies that kind of involve your mind and thinking and thoughts, some lifestyle strategies, diet, exercise, and then some relaxation methods to deal with anxiety. Okay, so let's talk about some cognitive strategies. The first is kind of going back to this idea of uncertainty and how when you have anxiety, you really have a hard time with this idea of uncertainty in the future. And so One thing I want to talk about is working on changing your perspective. And studies of resilient people show that they actually enjoy a challenge, right? And fully expect to creatively solve problems as they arrive. So they don't see it as a threat, they see it as a challenge, right? And so, how can we become less afraid of the unknown and face challenges with curiosity and kind of a sense of newness in our lives? One way we can learn to deal with uncertainty in our life is to look at those who actually thrive in uncertainty, right? And I want to talk for a moment about self-actualized people. And self-actualized people are essentially people who have been able to reach their full potential, right? They have a lot of meaning and purpose in their lives, and they're generally pretty happy. And these people have been studied a lot, and there's a lot of characteristics that have helped them self-actualize, and one of them is creativity. And I want you to listen to this quote. The self-actualized are often not creative in the usual artistic forms. Their creativity is more of a process and an attitude than the product. Their creativity extends to a way of approaching all of life. They find fresh, direct solutions with naive newness. I just love this quote, and this is from Abraham Maslow, and he's the guy, who studies self-actualization. Okay, so how can we be like these self-actualized people and see and kind of look at a problem in a more creative way? And I think one way you can do it, this has really resonated for me, is enjoy the process and see it as a challenge. But first, for a moment, let's talk about you personally. Do you think you're more process-oriented or outcome-oriented? And I think it's really hard just in our culture because we measure everything with kind of these tangible outcomes, like you're successful if you get that promotion or that bigger house or that car. And so these outcomes, they're measurable, right? Some of these more process measures, they're harder, right? And like if you're happy, if you have meaning or purpose, or if times were hard and you like got a lot out of it, that's hard to measure. But it's kind of when you're in the process, and if you can let yourself be okay in the good and bad times, that's actually where you learn the most. So I think maybe if you are a more outcome related person, maybe start focusing more on the process and really acknowledge when you've hit a milestone in the process. And I think a lot of good things can happen when you do that. And another thing you can do is just have fun, be curious. This is like very childlike energy. You look at kids with problems, they just deal with things in a totally different way. They just always have such fun, creative ways to look at the problem. And I think this was a game changer for me with my anxiety. You actually have choice. You don't have to look at the problem with doom and gloom. You can actually have fun with it, right? And so just ask yourself, how can you habitually face life with some curiosity and newness? And then I think lastly, it's like, how can you be okay when things don't go your way, right? A lot of anxiety is about control. Do people like me? Am I good enough? How can you be okay if, you know what, I'm me, I'm going to accept this situation, I'm going to accept that person? Just kind of have some fun playing with these concepts. They might seem a little abstract, but if you do play with them, I think you'll see a lot of really good results. Another thing you can do to kind of help you with your excessive worrying is to try to let go of catastrophizing, right? So first off, you have to acknowledge that regardless, some unpleasant things are going to happen in life. And like I said, it's just part of that acceptance, right? And then pay attention and catch yourself and recognize kind of when your thoughts are irrational. Like going back to my skiing example, like in that moment, when I kind of sat and thought about it, I'm like, you know what, chances are My husband and I are not going to die skiing today. And so I think just that practice on a daily basis, when you do kind of see yourself spiraling, and going to the worst place, catch yourself and then think of another outcome. Okay, so if you are catastrophizing and everything is horrible, think of other things that could happen, right? And then lastly, offer positive affirmations to yourself because like I said, a lot of our anxious thoughts, they come from our ego and they're not very nice, and you're very hard on yourself. You're very judgmental of yourself, of other people, of situations. So I think a part of this process is just acknowledging when you have acknowledged your catastrophizing and acknowledge when you're catching your irrational thoughts, and then congratulating yourself and then thinking positive moving forward. All of these things can kind of start the process of like training your brain to think in a new way that's not so dire, right? But I think it's also important to allow yourself to worry, but have it be strategic, right? Because I think there's definitely such a thing of too little worry. When you get so stressed out, you kind of check out and you can't even deal with it. That's the thing too. So acknowledge that even though you're anxious and you're worried, it can be a good thing. If you can learn how to channel your anxious energy, you can actually be quite productive with it. So think for a moment about whatever's making you anxious. And in a certain circumstance, and think to yourself, when should you take a risk with this situation? And then consider the worst possible outcome. Can you live with it? And if not, don't risk it. And I find when I go through this process of being really worried and fearful about the future, I kind of realize a lot of the worst places I go, or like I think so negatively, can I live with it? A lot of times I actually can, and it makes me realize I'm stronger than I actually am, and it kind of helps your self-esteem, and it's like, I've got this. But if not, don't risk it and stop worrying about it. Or you have to take rational steps to prevent it or to make it better. Actually do something about it rather than just worrying about it. So think of something you could do, like in this moment, today, tomorrow, to actually deal with what's bothering you. But here's a quick tip. Don't do this before bedtime, right? Do this in the afternoon or in the morning. And lastly, if you're really kind of struggling with some of this excessive worrying, just try to focus on what's going on right now and what you can do about this problem right now. Do you know how many times I tell myself, one day at a time? It can help you incredibly. And one way we can kind of teach ourselves just to kind of focus on the present moment is using mindfulness. Mindfulness can kind of help us become aware of what we do physically when we become anxious or angry, so we can kind of like tap into that, and it's like, oh, I'm anxious, and then we can kind of calm ourselves down before we spiral. And then also, mindfulness helps us stay with this discomfort, right? It's so, I think sometimes with anxiety, the physical symptoms can be so intense, we just want it to go away. But it's actually learning how to lean into those symptoms and get more comfortable with them can kind of take some of the power out of the anxiety, and it also increases the capacity to deal with anxiety, and it takes the control away from the anxiety. Okay, now we're going to talk about some lifestyle changes you can start doing right now to help you manage your anxiety. And the first is diet. And so what we eat, no surprise, this totally impacts the way we feel physically and mentally. And there's a lot of research that's showing good nutrition and a healthy diet are associated with better well-being and mental health outcomes. And one thing in particular with anxiety is if you're not eating enough or if you're not eating the proper foods, you can get a blood sugar crash. We all know how that feels, when you're hangry. This actually triggers a stress response in our body. So you can maybe be triggering anxiety when you're not actually worried about anything. So I'm just going to give you a few quick diet tips to kind of prevent this blood sugar crash. I think right now there's so many diets and fads, what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat. And so I'm going to try to keep things super simple. My number one recommendation is eating whole carbs and whole foods. Whole carbs are super important. They're unprocessed, they contain fiber, and unfortunately, they're only found in about 5% of our carb consumption. And the important thing about carbs is these are the foods that give us the nutrition and they keep us fuller longer, particularly because they have the fiber. I'm always talking about fiber. If you're going to do one thing for your diet today, just start eating more fiber. It will do wonders, I promise. Okay, so let's talk about some of the benefits of whole foods. So, probably one of the most important things, they contain a lot of essential vitamins and nutrients every system in our body needs to kind of operate at an optimal level. And also whole grains and some of these whole foods, they're very high in fiber and they're fat-free. And the benefit of this is they're more slowly digested and absorbed than refined carbohydrates. And so this is what keeps us feeling fuller longer. And these whole foods also have inflammation lowering effects on our bodies. And so this is going to help us have a healthy, diverse microbiome in the gut. And there's the gut microbiome research is actually quite fascinating right now because it's directly related to our immune system and mental health. But you know, we all love our processed, refined carbs. I know I do. They have all the good stuff, the fat, the sugar, the salt. They're delicious. But the problem with these types of food is they've stripped out a lot of the nutrients and fiber, and so it leaves your body wanting more. So like you can eat a whole bag of potato chips, tons of calories, tons of fat, but then an hour later you're hungry again and then you get this blood sugar crash I was talking about. So these foods are definitely fine in moderation. I'm not like anti this food at all. I have chips in my cupboard right now. It's just really important you have that balance of whole foods with these processed foods. So maybe at work, if you have, one of those days, like a lot of us, where we're rushing around and we barely get time to eat, and you go to Maverick or whatever, maybe try picking up a bag of trail mix that has some nuts, some dried fruit, some seeds in it. Those are all the types of foods that are going to keep us full and prevent a blood sugar crash opposed to the chips. And I promise you, like this will help with your anxiety. It's pretty crazy. So there's actually a few small things you can start changing in your diet that actually can make quite a big difference. Okay, the next thing we can do to help with our anxiety is exercise. We know for certain exercise can improve our energy levels, reduce stress and tension, and boost our mood. And it's all because of those endorphins, right? It's just like a natural drug, a natural high. And studies consistently show that exercise has a pretty profound anxiety reducing effect. And so what they found is you need about 20 minutes of high intensity needed for benefit. But also, I think at times pay attention when you need to slow down and maybe do a workout like yoga, because I think some of those really intense competitive workouts sometimes can kind of keep you in that stress overdrive, like the ego I was saying, kind of keeping some of those hormones going. And so I think sometimes we forget like yoga, a slow walk, like that actually is exercise too. So just pay attention if maybe your body needs a rest. And then most importantly with exercise, find something you like. Exercise should not be torture chamber. If it is, you're not going to do it. So really hone into what it is you like to do, and you're way more likely to stick with it. Okay, and last but not least is sleep. Sleep is the best, least expensive anxiety medication, but for some of us with anxiety, we know sleep can be hard. So here's some tips to kind of calm your body down so you're better able to sleep if you do have anxiety. So a lot of our sleep is based off of our circadian rhythms, which is our sleep-wake cycle. And this is cued by light. And this light kind of informs our body like when it should start feeling sleepy and release melatonin. So one thing you can do is kind of start creating a routine every night. So I think one thing you can do, I do this around 9 o'clock, go around your house, turn off all the overhead lights, turn on lamps, and just kind of start dimming the lights, shut the blinds, and then no phone in the room. This is a hard one, but this can be a game changer. Get a good old alarm clock, get the phone out of the room, and then turn off your electronics 90 minutes before you go to sleep. I think it's totally fine to like watch a show that's relaxing to you, like a cooking show or a sitcom. Just try not to engage in any kind of electronic social media that kind of gets you going, because that's the worst thing you want to do before you sleep. And another thing you can do is use guided imagery to help you with racing thoughts before bed, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some relaxation strategies to manage our stress and anxiety. Um, and there's actually a reason for this. We're going to be talking about things like meditation, yoga, mindfulness, and I think there's this connotation out there that this is kind of like hippie kind of stuff, but these type of modalities are actually very grounded in science, and there's a reason for that. When we relax our body, we engage our parasympathetic nervous system, and this is the opposite of fight or flight. So when this part of our nervous system is in charge, our blood pressure reduces, our heart rate slows, our breathing slows, and actually activates our prefrontal cortex, which I was talking about. This is the part we want to be, part of the brain we want to be using more because it deals with stress better, and then this can train our brain to be less anxious. When we're relaxed, we're also in a state called homeostasis. And normal homeostasis is where we want to be. It kind of keeps us healthy, protects us, keeps us safe. And this is basically an optimal balance of hormones, immunity, and nervous system functioning. So this is kind of like where we want to be most of the time. This is when you feel calm, you feel content, you feel peaceful, you feel in control. And this is when your body, all the systems, hormones, everything are running just the way they should. So breathing is probably the easiest and most effective thing we can do in the moment if we're having problems with anxiety or excessive worry. What happens when we're anxious is we tend to breathe in our chest, kind of these shallow breaths in our chest, and that can actually activate fight or flight. And then we activate fight or flight, and then our brain kind of goes there, and it's like, I'm anxious, just by the way we're breathing. So one thing we can do when we're anxious is kind of train our breath to just kind of calm ourselves down. So some simple breathing meditations can be very helpful. And I think for anxiety, one of my favorite breathing techniques is this 4-7-8. So you hold your breath, you breathe in for 4, hold for 7, and then breathe out for 8. And then you repeat this as many times as necessary. And I think there's something about holding the breath that kind of the tension builds, and then you release it, and it feels really good. So if you're anxious, click on some of these links and play around with some of these breathing exercises. So the next strategy is progressive muscle relaxation. And I think one thing when we have kind of chronic anxiety is we just get really tense in our bodies all the time, and we kind of forget what a relaxed muscle even feels like. And so some of these relaxation techniques can actually teach us how to really get in tune with certain parts of our body and where we're holding stress. And so you kind of tense, and then you let go, And then the research behind this kind of says that you can turn on your parasympathetic nervous system, just by tensing and releasing the muscles because, it just feels really good. So here's a link. You have to kind of lay down and get really quiet. This is kind of meditative, but it can be really effective in dealing with anxiety. Another really effective strategy for anxiety is imagery. Like I said, a lot of anxiety is feeling threatened or like you're not safe. And with guided imagery, you can kind of create your own little world where you feel very safe, and it's very, you use all your senses, and it can kind of help you get some mental detachment from the anxiety you're feeling, going into your kind of own little peaceful world and gain some new perspective. And I have to say, if you do struggle with sleep and anxiety, this is a great practice to do before bed. And here's the link, and it has some really great different kind of practices that can take you through. And I have to say too, guided imagery works really good for young children and teens. And so if this is something that interests you, you should definitely check it out. Okay, so the last relaxation strategy I want to talk about is body work. And these are things like Pilates, yoga, maybe even Tai Chi. And what it is basically putting your body under stress while you're relaxing the mind. And this can kind of become a metaphor for life. So it's kind of like calmness under stress or mental discomfort. And I really related to this the first time I did yoga. When I was experiencing anxiety, I absolutely hated it. Like it brought up a lot of anger and discomfort in my body. And I think it was because I was holding so much anxiety in my body. It was kind of getting it out. It was kind of uncomfortable. But the more you practice it and the more you stick with it, you kind of learn how to ease into that discomfort, and then you can really take that into everyday life. And now I'm a certified yoga teacher, and I love it, and I can find comfort in the pain and poses, which is actually very stress relieving. It's crazy, but it is. And I'm really in love with this yoga with Adriene. She has a YouTube channel, and she's fantastic. You can do yoga for stress, anxiety, depression, and she'll kind of really talk you through mind body, what's happening with yoga. It's not this intense like what you see at the gym yoga. So if you're interested in all trying yoga, I would recommend starting here. Okay, sorry I lied. So I have one more. So mindfulness. Mindfulness, I talked about this a little bit, and I gave you a link, and it's a really great link, but this can kind of help you change the way you relate to your thoughts. And it can kind of teach you that your thoughts are temporary and that they're going to pass. So if you're anxious, like I said, rather than getting kind of in that downward spiral, just accepting the anxiety, feeling it, acknowledging it will pass, it takes a lot of the power and control out of the anxiety. And so I really definitely suggest maybe getting some books on mindfulness. This mindfulness link has a lot of great different exercises. So out of all of these strategies I gave you, maybe just start with one, do some learning, do some exploring, see what works for you. You might love one thing and hate another thing. This is all just kind of part of your process for sure. Okay guys, just want to end on giving you guys some resources. If you feel like you are struggling with more intense anxiety and it's interfering with your everyday life, you should definitely look into getting some help, because it's one of those things that can definitely be treated and managed, and there's no reason to live your life, suffering or in this discomfort. So I hope you guys all take advantage of some of the services PEHP offers. Okay, so that's all I have for you. Thanks for watching the webinar, and I hope you guys I'll have a better understanding of anxiety and worry and how to cope and manage. And if you guys have any questions or if you want any recommendations for books or anything, I have a whole library. Just email me and I would love to help you guys out. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me. Thank you.